This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 8th, 1990, Iraq announces the annexation of its neighbor country, Kuwait, setting up what is essentially a puppet regime in that small country. This is after Iraqi dictator Sadaam Hussein had sent 100,000 troops into Kuwait, invading the country, sparking a conflict that, of course, the U.S. would eventually step into as well in what became known as the First Gulf War. But that didn't take place until January of 1991. But on this evening in August of 1990, President George Bush is already kind of laying out the big stakes as he sees it. He gives an address to the United States people saying, "Today, as president, I ask for your support in a decision I've made to stand up for what's right and condemn what's wrong, all in the cause of peace. We are beginning a new era." As was the case in the 1930s, we see in Saddam Hussein an aggressive dictator threatening his neighbors. And so the U.S. decides to step in first in the summer and fall of 1990, what's known as Operation Desert Shield, which is the buildup, and then Operation Desert Storm, as I mentioned, comes in January of 91 with troops actually on the ground and actual conflict with Iraq and Kuwait. We've talked about that 1990 Gulf War a lot on this show, but I really want to get into this decision to intervene and this framing from Bush rather than how the war itself played out. And I will also say that I have a kind of personal, honestly, foundational memory of this moment that kind of affected my family in a big way, and I will share that in a minute as well. But here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So let's start a little bit with the TikTok of kind of how we get to this moment. I think people know, Iraq decides to invade Kuwait. But what is the sort of larger context there of why Saddam Hussein becomes aggressive in this way in this moment?
So much of it has to do with the Iran-Iraq war that ran throughout the 1980s. This was a pretty devastating, grinding war. Both Iraq and Iran poured a ton of money into it. The United States kind of played both sides. Iran had been an ally of the U.S., but this is post-1979, post-revolution, post-Iran hostage crisis. And so the U.S. was also backing Iraq in the conflict. And at the end of that war, Saddam Hussein was feeling the pinch. His economy was struggling to recover. There was a big question of how much oil money was going to be coming in. He wanted more control over the price of oil so that the Iraqi economy could rebound. He also didn't think that Iraq should have to pay its war debts after the war. He felt like that was too much of a burden on the country. He owed a ton of money. The country owed a ton of money to both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and was also starting to feel isolated by other countries that were aligning with the U.S. So rather than pay back war debts to Kuwait, he was like, what if we just took it over instead? Nobody's going to stop us. Who cares about Kuwait? It'll be fine. And so does indeed lead an invasion into Kuwait.
Kuwait, small country, sitting right there, has lots of oil, and again, these debts. And so what's one good way to get your debts canceled is by
take over another country.
Yes, I should invade the Mohila service provider who services my student debts. But sorry, that's an improper joke for the gravity of this story. But that's the context. And yes, I think Hussein, who obviously is a dictator in his country, mounts this invasion. Let's get to kind of how the U.S. sees this and frames it and then starts to take these steps. But gosh, Kellie, and all of us, what do we make of these remarks? I mean, on the very night, the very first remarks, Bush is saying things like, we are beginning a new era. And he name checks the 1930s and says, we see here an aggressive dictator threatening his neighbors in the way that we saw in the 1930s.
Absolutely. I mean, he's comparing Saddam Hussein to Hitler. I mean, when we think about the 1930s, when we think about the fact that Bush is a World War II veteran, I mean, all of this is very salient. And so this idea that, Saddam Hussein is trying to expand sparks a lot of fear in people who feel like this is resonant to us. And so in his speech, when he says, basically Saddam Hussein can't be trusted. He said he wouldn't invade, and then he invaded. He said he would withdraw, and then he didn't withdraw. He says, his promises mean nothing. Mm-hmm. The narrative that he's shaping is to really show Saddam Hussein, this is a dangerous man. This is a man who will stop at nothing to get what he wants. And we ought to be as terrified of him as we were of Hitler. Or maybe better said, we ought to be as aggressive with him as we were with Hitler.
Or maybe we weren't with Hitler, right? I mean, there's a little bit embedded in here of we didn't see what was coming when Hitler first started to make moves. And now, let's learn the lesson of history and see where this could end up.
Right. No appeasement. And I think it also matters that, Kellie mentioned that Bush was a World War II veteran. He's also calling back to what in the American imagination was the last quote unquote good war, right? This isn't going to be Vietnam. We're not going to get bogged down in Iraq. We are facing an enemy who is like Hitler, and we know how to defeat an enemy like Hitler. We stand strong. We don't engage in appeasement. We come with, they don't use the phrase at the time, but shock and awe, right? Overwhelming force in order to stamp out sort of this would-be Hitler in his cradle.
Yeah. So he also uses this phrase, we're beginning a new era. And I don't know, maybe this is where I'll share my kind of personal, how this intersects, honestly, with my personal history, with my family's history. So I think listeners know, you two know, that I grew up in Central America, in Costa Rica. My parents were there to cover, as journalists, to cover a lot of the conflict in Central America and in South America, Panama, Nicaragua, Colombia. In the 80s, that was the geopolitical hotspot in many ways, and especially for the U.S. There was a lot of news in that region that my parents covered for outlets in the United States. One of my earliest, and certainly I think the most impactful memory of my kind of early childhood or late early childhood was the fall of 1990, and then in particular when the U.S. actually starts to invade and the conflict begins in 1991. And watching it on CNN with my parents, and this is another element in this story, that war was the first sort of cable news war. And my parents literally turning to me and being like, the world is going to stop paying attention to us, to this region now. The attention has just shifted to the Middle East. And it was just like that. In one instant, you could see the attention of the world shift. And basically, I'd say the attention has been on the Middle East since that moment. And I mean, in the way that it affected us personally, 3 years later, my parents have to move back to the United States because there's just less desire for news from Central America. The conflicts didn't go away. The issues didn't go away. It's just that the attention shifted. I think about that all the time.
They weren't wrong.
Yeah, they weren't wrong. But I mean, literally, they called it. The moment those Scud missiles were flying, they were like, the world doesn't care about Central America anymore. And it was just remarkable. But to come back to this Bush comment, he's calling that too, right? He is saying we are beginning a new era. So when he says that, what does he mean? I mean, obviously, 1990 here, the Cold War has just ended, right? And so already he's calling kind of this is the new hotspot, but moreover, this is the new sort of narrative. When he uses that word era, he's not just saying this is a geopolitically important region. He's saying there's a sort of new narrative emerging.
Right. For George Bush's entire political career, the geopolitical reality was the Cold War. And the Cold War had come to an end while he was president. And now he has an opportunity to create what one might call a new world order. Yeah. What does it look like with the Soviet Union and the U.S. no longer at odds? The Soviet Union's not going to last another year. And so what does it mean to have the U.S. in charge? And how is the U.S. going to demonstrate the way that it's going to lead? Because somebody like Saddam Hussein was looking around and was like, the U.S. is kind of a paper tiger. It's been sort of locked in this Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is falling apart. The U.S. is not going to get involved in this regional conflict. And Bush saw that as a moment where he had to show that the U.S. was going to be a leader on the world stage, was willing to use military power in order to shore up this new world order with the U.S. in charge, but also with all of these international institutions backing it and an international coalition organized by the U.S. leading the way in Iraq. That idea that the U.S. would be in charge but wasn't acting alone was a big part of Bush's vision for what that new world order would look like.
I think people don't realize, too, that Iraq at the time has the fourth largest standing army. To me, I was a little blown by that. I was like, oh, really? I mean, I don't think people understood necessarily how much of a player, Iraq could be and how much of a threat people saw Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And this accelerates so quickly. I mean, I remember, Jody, you're talking about this probably like third grade or fourth grade for me, thinking about Desert Storm and the war and that becoming a new part, part of the world becoming a new part of my thinking as a child, about thinking about the Middle East as a space that was not on the radar before and very much was now.
Yeah.
And thinking about it in a new context. I mean, this, I think, is what I took from your story about Central America, Jody, is that the U.S. had viewed the world through the lens of the Soviet Union and the Cold War and had absolutely viewed Central and South America through that lens. And as that goes away, I mean, the U.S. had been involved in the Middle East, but had seen it as a series of proxy wars. And now it's not necessarily proxy wars anymore, especially in this case where the Soviet Union, such as it is, and the U.S. are on the same side in this coalition trying to beat back Iraq.
There's also something here. I mean, in some way, right, if you think of the Cold War as a large extension of the sort of fear around the domino theory, that we have to kind of shore up anti-communism everywhere, or because otherwise countries will continue to fall to this ideology. There's a little bit of that here too, right? If we don't take a stand now, Saddam Hussein is going to take over country by country. And, he'd already been threatening Saudi Arabia, and obviously Israel is the element to all this is very fraught as well. So, there's a sense of that like cascade and domino effect. But I will point out that it is very different, and to put it bluntly, like a little cleaner, to say, oh, the dominoes are going to fall because of this one evil madman. Then, the dominoes are going to fall because of this ideology that is spreading around the world. And so I just think like the ability to point to this one evil madman, and that's, I think, where the Hitler parallel comes in. It's like, here is this one guy. We need to stop this one bad guy who has all these ambitions. Okay, I don't want to get too into the war itself. I think people know the rough sketch of it. There is obviously the bigger question of the U.S. goes in. It is thought of as generally pretty fast and pretty decisive, pushing back of Iraq out of Kuwait. There was obviously this big lingering question that was asked at the time, and then certainly continues to get asked as we move through the 90s into the early 2000s, and we end up going back into Iraq, of this question of, the opportunity to get rid of Saddam. Should the victory have been more decisive in the first Gulf War? And instead, he lingers around, and he's there for the second Bush to go after and finish the job his dad never did, as they say. But I'm curious what you make of that, in particular because I'm really struck by this quote from Dick Cheney in 1992, so just after the first Gulf War, but Dick Cheney, who obviously has a big hand in the second Gulf War, Dick Cheney responding to this question of should we gone in and really gotten rid of Hussein. He says, if we had gotten in there, we would still have forces in Baghdad today. We would have to be running that country. We would not have been able to get out and bring everybody home. And for Dick Cheney to have that awareness of the perils of going in to Iraq in 1992, and he's describing exactly what happened in the wake of the subsequent Gulf War, which is, oh gosh, we're stuck there, and now we're basically having to run that country, and look what it does to us. So, I don't know.
It's such a sign of Vietnam syndrome, right? Like, it's this idea that we are not interested in regime change. We don't want to own Iraq. We don't want to run this country. We don't want to occupy this country. Nobody has an appetite for that. And yet, not doing it then set up, 10 years later, this idea that we have to do regime change, because if we don't do regime change, then you just have this ongoing problem. And I'm sure our listeners have a lot of thoughts on the validness of that argument and how that all shook out. But it's interesting that at the time, in the early 1990s, there was an awareness that you break it, you bought it. That seems to have disappeared within a decade.
Yeah, from the very same people. Yeah. All right. Also on this day, so from listeners now, from time to time, we look at some other things that happened on this day. So let's switch gears to that. A couple little tidbits of things that also happened on August 8th throughout the years. So 1974, right?
1974, August 8th, completely irrelevant issue rose up in the presidency. President Richard Nixon, facing damaging new revelations in the Watergate scandal, announced that he would resign the following day.
There you go. In 1814, during the War of 1812, peace talks begin between the United States and Britain in Ghent, Belgium, and that is eventually where the peace treaty is signed. I like this one because I think I've mentioned on the show before, but it seems like every treaty is in Paris. There's just 15 different Paris treaties, and I'm like, good for Ghent, Ghent,
Let's switch it up a little bit.
And Ghent is very beautiful too. I mean, I would, I'm like, why wouldn't you want to go to Paris to sign a peace treaty? Why not? It's a lovely place. Ghent, quite nice as well. So, there you go. Good for Ghent.
Sure. And in 1942, during World War II, 6 Nazi saboteurs were captured after landing in the U.S. and were executed in Washington, D.C. 2 others cooperated with authorities were spared. Didn't we do an episode on this or no?
Episode.
I think we did.
But we've reached that point on the show where we're not totally sure.
And in 2009, Sonia Sotomayor was sworn in as the U.S. Supreme Court's first Hispanic and third female justice. She sits on the bench to this day.
Indeed she does. All right, so there you go. Other things that happened on August 8th throughout the years. That brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
We succeeded in the struggle for freedom in Europe because we and our allies remain stalwart. Keeping the peace in the Middle East will require no less. We're beginning a new era. This new era can be full of promise, an age of freedom, a time of peace for all peoples. But if history teaches us anything, it is that we must resist aggression or it will destroy our freedoms. Appeasement does not work. As was the case in the 1930s, we see in Saddam Hussein an aggressive dictator threatening his neighbors.
Radiotopia. From P